The cameras were rolling live when a Medal of Honor winner called Muhammad Ali a coward in front of 30 million viewers. What happened next in those tense 12 minutes would become the most watched moment in television history and transform both men's lives forever. If this story of unexpected grace under pressure moves you, subscribe for more untold moments that reveal what true character looks like when the whole world is watching. Drop a comment about a time when someone's response to criticism surprised you. Your story might inspire others. The red on-air light glowed ominously in Studio 6B at NBC's Rockefeller Center as The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson prepared for what would become the most controversial segment in the show's history. It was March 15, 1973, and Johnny Carson sat behind his iconic desk, adjusting his tie nervously as he prepared to introduce two guests who had no idea they were about to create television magic and mayhem in equal measure. The first guest was Colonel James Patterson, a 42-year-old career military officer whose chest bore the weight of America's highest military honors. The Medal of Honor hung prominently among his decorations, earned during a horrific firefight near Da Nang, where Patterson had single-handedly held off a Viet Cong assault for 6 hours, saving his entire platoon while sustaining 3 bullet wounds. 2 Purple Hearts flanked the Medal of Honor, testament to wounds received in earlier engagements, and a Bronze Star with V device spoke to additional acts of valor under fire. Patterson had enlisted as a private straight out of high school in rural Kansas, driven by a sense of duty that ran through his family like a genetic trait. His father had served in World War II, his grandfather in World War I. He was a genuine American hero in every sense of the word, invited on the show to promote his upcoming book, Leadership Under Fire, Lessons from the Battlefield, which had already become a bestseller among military families and business executives seeking to understand how ordinary people become extraordinary under pressure. The second guest was Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, who had agreed to appear on the show to discuss his upcoming fight against Ken Norton, scheduled for later that month. Ali's presence on mainstream television was still somewhat controversial in 1973, just 2 years after the Supreme Court had overturned his conviction for refusing military induction. But his box office appeal was undeniable, and Carson's producers knew his appearance would guarantee massive ratings. The champion had spent the afternoon at a Harlem mosque before flying to New York, participating in prayer and meditation that had left him unusually contemplative and peaceful. He sat in the green room, joking with his handlers and signing autographs for starstruck NBC employees, his famous wit and charm on full display as he entertained a small crowd that had gathered to catch a glimpse of the most famous athlete in the world. Ali was wearing an elegant dark blue suit with a silver tie, his hair perfectly styled and his confidence radiating through every gesture and smile. He was completely unaware that the next hour would test his character in ways no boxing ring ever could, that he was about to face an opponent far more dangerous than any heavyweight contender, a decorated war hero armed with moral authority and the sympathy of a nation still deeply divided about the Vietnam War. Carson opened the show with his usual monologue, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his voice as he prepared to bring out his first guest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carson announced to the studio audience and 30 million viewers watching at home, "please welcome a true American hero, Medal of Honor recipient Colonel James Patterson." The audience erupted in thunderous applause as Patterson walked onto the set, his military bearing evident in every step, his uniform immaculate and his medals catching the studio lights. Carson conducted a respectful interview with Patterson, discussing his military service and his book. Patterson spoke eloquently about duty, honor, and the sacrifices made by American servicemen in Vietnam. His answers were crisp and confident, delivered with the authority of a man who had earned the right to speak about courage through blood and sacrifice. The audience hung on his every word, clearly moved by his stories of heroism under fire. "Colonel Patterson," Carson said as they neared the end of the interview segment, "you've dedicated your life to serving this country with honor. What are your thoughts on those who chose a different path during the war?" It was meant to be a general question about military service versus civilian life, but Patterson's response would ignite a firestorm that neither Carson nor his producers had anticipated. Patterson's jaw tightened slightly and his eyes hardened as he leaned forward in his chair. "Johnny, I believe that when your country calls, you answer. Real men don't hide behind lawyers and religious exemptions. Real men don't let others fight and die in their place while they make millions entertaining people at home." The colonel's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, and though he hadn't mentioned any names, everyone in America knew exactly who he was talking about. Carson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that his carefully planned show was about to spiral beyond his control. "Well, Colonel, I know we have some strong feelings about—" But before Carson could finish his diplomatic deflection, Patterson continued his attack with devastating precision. "There are men who talk about being the greatest, while real greatness was being demonstrated in the jungles of Southeast Asia," Patterson said, his voice rising with each word. "There are people who claim to be champions, while the real champions were fighting and dying for the freedom that allowed them to become rich and famous. That's not courage, Johnny. That's cowardice dressed up in fancy words." The studio audience fell into stunned silence, and Carson's face went pale as he realized his show had just become a political lightning rod. In living rooms across America, 30 million viewers watched transfixed as this decorated war hero delivered what amounted to a character assassination of Muhammad Ali on national television. "And speaking of cowardice," Carson said, his voice strained as he tried to regain control of his show, "we'll be right back after this commercial break with heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali." The timing couldn't have been worse or more dramatic. As the cameras cut away for the commercial break, Patterson remained seated on the couch, his comments hanging in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Behind the scenes, panic erupted as producers frantically tried to decide how to handle the explosive situation they had inadvertently created. Ali's handlers immediately approached him in the green room, their faces pale with concern as they explained what had just happened on live television. "We can leave right now," his lawyer advised urgently, pacing back and forth across the small room. "You don't have to subject yourself to this kind of ambush. This wasn't what we agreed to when we booked this appearance." His trainer, Angelo Dundee, nodded in agreement, adding, "Champ, that man just called you a coward in front of the whole country. Nobody would blame you for walking away from the setup." Even Carson's own producers were suggesting they could end the show early, claiming technical difficulties or a medical emergency, anything to avoid the potential disaster of putting these two men together on live television. But Ali, who had faced hostile crowds and death threats throughout his career, who had been called everything from traitor to terrorist by millions of Americans, made a decision that would define his legacy far more than any fight in the ring. "No," Ali said quietly, his voice carrying a calm determination that surprised everyone around him. "I'm going out there. That man deserves to hear my side of the story, and America deserves to see how we handle disagreement in this country." As the commercial break ended and the cameras prepared to roll again, Ali walked onto the stage with the same confidence he brought to every boxing ring. But this time, his opponent was armed with moral authority and public sympathy. Carson's introduction was awkward and brief. "Ladies and gentlemen, Muhammad Ali." The applause was noticeably more subdued than usual, with many audience members clearly uncomfortable about cheering for a man who had just been labeled a coward by a genuine war hero. Ali took a seat next to Patterson, and the tension in the studio was so thick it seemed to press against the television cameras. "Muhammad," Carson began carefully, "I imagine you heard Colonel Patterson's comments during the commercial break." Ali nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Patterson's face. The colonel sat rigid in his chair, his jaw set and his gaze unflinching, clearly prepared for a confrontation. Instead of the angry defense or clever wordplay that everyone expected, Ali did something that shocked the 30 million viewers watching and completely disarmed Colonel Patterson. He stood up from his chair, walked the few steps to where Patterson sat, and extended his hand in greeting. "Colonel Patterson," Ali said softly, his voice carrying none of the braggadocio that had made him famous. "I want to thank you for your service to our country, and I want to thank you for saying what you believe. You earned the right to speak your mind through your sacrifice and courage, and I respect that, even if it hurts to hear it." Patterson, clearly taken aback by this gracious response to his public attack, hesitantly shook Ali's hand. The gesture was captured by cameras and broadcast into millions of homes, creating one of the most powerful images in television history. A moment of respect between two men who embodied completely different definitions of American courage. Ali returned to his seat, but instead of the defensive posture everyone expected, he leaned forward and addressed Patterson directly, as if the cameras and 30 million viewers had suddenly disappeared and they were just two men having an honest conversation. "Colonel, you said real men answer when their country calls, and you're absolutely right," Ali began, his voice steady and sincere. "But can I tell you about the country that called me? The country that called Muhammad Ali was one where I couldn't eat lunch next to a white child, couldn't sleep in the same hotel as white people, couldn't even drink from the same water fountain. The America that wanted me to fight for freedom overseas was the same America that denied me freedom at home." Patterson's expression began to change as Ali continued, the rigid certainty in his eyes giving way to something else: confusion, consideration, perhaps even understanding. "You fought for freedom in Vietnam, Colonel, and I honor that," Ali said, his voice growing stronger but never losing its respectful tone. "But I was fighting for freedom right here in America. When I refused to go to Vietnam, I wasn't running away from a fight. I was choosing which fight to fight. I was saying that I couldn't kill poor people in a foreign country when my own people were being killed by poverty and racism right here at home." The studio audience, which had been silent with tension, began to murmur as Ali's words sank in. Here was a perspective many of them had never considered, that Ali's refusal to serve wasn't cowardice, but a different kind of courage, the courage to stand alone against the entire country for what he believed was right. Ali stood up again and began pacing slowly in front of the couch, his hands gesturing as he spoke with a passion that reminded everyone watching why he was not just a great athlete, but a powerful speaker. "Colonel Patterson, you and I are more alike than different. We both looked at injustice and decided we couldn't stand by and do nothing. You fought injustice with a rifle in the jungles of Vietnam. I fought injustice with my voice and my career here in America. You risked your life for your beliefs. I risked my freedom, my career, my prime earning years for mine." Patterson, who had come onto the show prepared to deliver a moral lecture to a man he considered a coward, found himself listening to a perspective he had never considered. The conviction in Ali's voice, the sincerity of his explanation, and the respect he had shown despite being publicly humiliated, was forcing the colonel to question assumptions he had held for years. "But Colonel," Ali continued, his voice softening as he sat back down, "I want you to know something. Every day since I made that decision, I've thought about men like you. I've thought about the soldiers who went in my place, who faced dangers I never had to face, and I've wondered if there was another way, if I could have served my country and my conscience at the same time." The camera zoomed in on Patterson's face, capturing the moment when decades of certainty began to crack. Tears formed in the corners of his eyes as he struggled with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. The man he had come to condemn as a coward was showing him a depth of character and moral complexity that he hadn't imagined possible. "You know what haunts me, Colonel?" Ali asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent studio. "It's not the criticism or the hatred or even losing my title. It's wondering if my choice made things harder for men like you. It's wondering if standing up for what I believed in somehow dishonored the sacrifice of soldiers who believed in something different." The silence that followed was absolute. 30 million Americans watched as two men who had embodied opposite sides of the most divisive issue of their generation found common ground in mutual respect and shared pain. Carson, veteran of thousands of television interviews, found himself speechless in the face of such raw honesty and unexpected grace. Finally, Colonel Patterson spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Muhammad," he said, using Ali's chosen name for the first time, "I came here tonight believing you were a coward. I came here believing that there was only one way to serve your country, only one definition of courage." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "But listening to you, seeing the respect you've shown me even after I attacked you on national television, I realized I was wrong about you. Not wrong about the importance of military service, but wrong about you as a man." The colonel stood up, his military bearing evident, but somehow softened by the emotion of the moment. "You're not a coward, Muhammad. You're a different kind of soldier fighting a different kind of war. I may not agree with all your choices, but I can respect the courage it took to make them, and I can respect the man who made them." What happened next created one of the most powerful moments in television history. Colonel Patterson, the decorated war hero who had come to humiliate Muhammad Ali, extended his hand not in greeting, but in apology. Ali took it, and the two men embraced on live television, their reconciliation witnessed by millions of Americans who had been taught to see them as enemies. "I'm sorry, Muhammad," Patterson said, his words carrying the weight of genuine contrition. "I'm sorry for attacking you without trying to understand your perspective. I'm sorry for judging your courage by my definition instead of trying to understand yours." Ali's response would be quoted in newspapers across the country the next day. "Colonel, you have nothing to apologize for. You spoke from your heart about what you believe, and that takes courage too. We may have chosen different battles, but we both chose to fight for something bigger than ourselves. That makes us brothers, not enemies." Johnny Carson, finally finding his voice, addressed the cameras with tears in his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is something special. Two men who disagree fundamentally about one of the most important issues of our time, but who found a way to respect each other's courage and conviction. This is what America is supposed to look like." The impact of that 12-minute segment extended far beyond the television studio and continued to resonate through American culture for decades. The footage was replayed on news programs for weeks, analyzed by political commentators and social scientists, discussed in editorial pages across the country, and eventually studied in journalism schools as an example of how honest dialogue could bridge even the deepest divides. The moment became a cultural touchstone, referenced in books about leadership, conflict resolution, and the power of grace under pressure. More importantly, it changed how millions of Americans viewed both men and the complex moral questions surrounding the Vietnam War, proving that understanding was possible even between people who seemed to represent irreconcilable differences. Colonel Patterson and Muhammad Ali maintained an extensive correspondence for the rest of Ali's life, their unlikely friendship becoming a symbol of how